I have some notes because it's very important to me to clearly state everything I'd like to. I've always been a major summoner. I have spent all my life knowing in one way or another of the existence of non-physical without necessarily the terminology that for the last 15 years I've aligned with Abraham in loving, in believing, in accepting, and in benefiting from. It's been wonderful, and yet I find myself right now in a greater need of some clarification that I'll explain now than ever before. I know you can never go back as we're always progressing forward, but the perspective is almost like that of a regression of consciousness or a spiritual withdrawal from anything I've experienced before. And I'll explain. Last year, my mother passed on. It was not unexpected. It was not traumatic. It was time. Some years before, my father had gone. The house that I grew up with and had always been was easily sold fairly soon after. What shocked me, what sort of caught me by surprise was after this whole scenario, I found myself suddenly sort of adrift, questioning everything, all aspects of my life, my career, my relationships, my self, my existence in a much deeper way. And up until this point, it's been although I go up and down on the emotional scale as I'm summon a lot and have different resistance, it's been very easy for me to accept things as I go through them and have things work out for me. It's not always an instant manifestation, but it's always been pretty good. And suddenly, the level of what I now feel was somewhat superficial acceptance doesn't do it for me anymore. It's like I need a deeper reason. And so I've done a certain amount of just questioning myself. Why is this going on? Why am I in more judgment of others and myself? Why am I in less allowance? I don't get exact answers.
Or why did the reemergence of my parents set me off kilter in this unusual for me way?
Right. And I know some of it, although intellectually I'm in alignment with the concept of non-physical and with the greater sense, regardless of I've never really had to identify the specifics of exactly what it is, just knowing that it is bigger than what's here in the physical visible now, I knew was nailed. But there's a part of me now, and I've got three quick clarity questions.
Before you go there, and we want to hear you fully, we want to say to you that the reason that the reemergence, or what you call death, of your parents, and we're not only speaking with you, we're speaking of so many that have a similar experience that you're having. The reason that it is so upsetting to you is because without meaning to, and certainly in the last 15 years since you've been listening to us, you really didn't know you were doing it or mean to do it. But there is a powerful tendency of most children, and everyone is someone's child, to, without meaning to, see and expect the majority of the well-being that flows to you to come through the vortex that is parent. Even long after it's not the vortex through which any obvious means of support is happening. But because you started out seeing them as a primary object of attention, and because so much of the well-being that flowed to you did come through that vortex, and because you were trained by them and by your society to care passionately about their perspective of you, most physical humans don't allow themselves to really be born until their parents die. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, but most of you do not accept your autonomy. Most of you do not accept your connection with your stream of energy. Most of you do not understand that you have direct access to this vortex of well-being. And there are a lot of people that look to a lot of other superficial vortexes as the avenue through which their well-being flows. But the mother of all vortexes is mother. You see.
Yeah,
And so that's what it is all about. In other words, we think that, and you're noticing it already, that it takes a little bit of time to adjust to your new way of seeing life experience. Esther was stunned because she is someone who has been well connected directly and has known it for some time. And yet, when her father made his transition, it surprised her how impactful it was. And for a month or more, every morning, the first thought she had when she reemerged back into her physical body was, oh yes, Daddy's dead. It was like she had to readjust to that. Now, she had not been looking to him for support in years and years and years. In fact, not emotional support, certainly not financial support. In fact, it was the other way around now.
Exactly.
In other words, she was the offerer of all of that. But still, there is somewhere in your vibrational roots that you call the belief system that you began. In other words, every thought that you've ever thought still exists. And so just seeing someone who at one time you had a vibrational relationship with cannot help but reactivate what that vibrational relationship was, unless you've worked very hard to make it a vibrational relationship that is different. And most people don't do that. Most of you, when you go home, Esther said, what is this feeling? I would describe it as homesick. And then she said, oh yeah, home makes me sick. And what that is about is anytime you go somewhere where a large part of your past is activated, that part of your past that's activated within you is now vibrationally in competition with the vibration that you are now. So it is a pretty normal thing that when something happens that takes your attention back, that you reactivate a vibration that you had left behind for a while, and now as it is reactivated, it is sticking out like a sore thumb with the vibration that is now who you really are. It is nice to know that time causes a diffusion of that activation, especially if you can resist the temptation of going back and traipsing through the memories. In other words, people say, I went back for the funeral and it was so nice to see everyone. And what they mean is we just stirred up all kinds of stuff that would have been a little better off left behind. In other words, we just reactivated who we all used to be and stirred up this big competition between who we used to be and who we are now. And then none of us felt very good for a long time after. I wonder why.
Right.
Yes.
Well, it certainly makes sense.
Yes.
A lot of how it's affected me is who I am now is in a self-image that doesn't have the safety net of, quote, the parent's perspective anymore, the unconditional love that used to always be there, so to speak.
Well,
so it's more like
what we have always hoped that any parent would do for any child is serve as an example of your own inner being. In other words, when your parent adores you, that's what your inner being does. Your inner being always adores you. And you've been hearing us. We have been wanting you to develop a conscious awareness of your relationship with your inner being and make it your primary relationship. In other words, we want you to care more about your relationship with your source energy or your inner being or your Abraham or whatever it is you're wanting to call this than any person that you interact with. And it's lovely when you have a parent who has been an appreciator because you've been showered with that pure positive energy. But the disadvantage of it is that you learn that well-being flows through a vortex that then you must be able to keep active, and you cannot. You don't have control over anybody's vortex other than your own. They're going to croak for sure and let you down.
That is the whole purpose for my questions right here, is the primary importance, the increased priority of importance of establishing a tangible physical connection.
Well, remember Magellan, and remember what the guidance system is all about, and remember what your guidance system tells you, and remember that the basis of it is the way you feel. So try not to make this too much of a thought process, and instead just make it a I'm on the rampage of feeling the best possible feeling that I can find experience. In other words, when you say and really understand, and you know, as much as we talk about it, in fact, it's just about the only thing that we talk about. As much as we talk about your relationship with your source and your guidance system that tells you about it, it is interesting how people disregard the way they feel. People will walk into situations or have conversations or even take a mental trip through a memory experience as if the way the thought feels is unimportant. Even a room full of deliberate creators like we are all here today, very often our human friends will witness something and the reality of it just sort of snows them. It's like the reality of it means more than the way I feel as I am involved in the reality of it. And you have to reach this place where reality doesn't mean diddly squat. In other words, it just does not matter what's manifesting. Truth, facts, history, none of that makes any difference. The only thing that matters is how I feel as I see it, how I feel as I see it, how I feel as I remember it, how I feel as I ponder it, how I feel as I think about it, how I feel as I discuss it, how I feel, how I feel, how I feel. Because until you say, I care how I feel, then there are going to be all kinds of things that are just going to drag you around in places you don't want to be, and you're like a ship without a rudder. In other words, you're just moving about by the tides of influence that surround, not able to guide yourself. But when you say, I care how I feel, in fact, I care so much that I'm going to think and feel and think and feel and think and feel. In fact, I care so much about how I feel that I'm going to think with how I feel in mind. I'm going to say, I think I'll say this. Now, how might that feel? Well, now I'm saying it. How does it feel? Well, it feels pretty good. I've felt better. I've felt worse. What could I say or think that might feel better? And until you start guiding yourself solely from that perspective, then there may be many things that will drag you by the ankles for a while.